If this is the OG, then that would make this the Godfather. Now, when this camera was first introduced in September of 2012, it was really something that no one had ever seen before, both in terms of the images it produced, as well as its overall design and build. It boasted 13 stops of dynamic range, recording cinema DNG RAW internally at 2.5k. All that for the introductory price of $3,000, which was a year later lowered down to $2,000. That was unheard of at the time. Now, just to put things into perspective, when this camera was released, the Sony line of A7 cameras didn't even exist yet. The Canon 7D was only 3 years old, and Red was only 2 years into their line of Scarlett and Epic Mysterium cameras. Blackmagic was mostly known for their development of video capture cards and other forms of hardware. No one was really expecting them to come out with a camera, especially one as game-changing as this. Now, of course, 8 years later, Blackmagic is one of the leaders in prosumer-grade cinema cameras, and it all started with this guy. Now, I was able to pick this up used off of eBay for 550 euros. It included a cage, a set of rails, and 2 SSD drives for recording, which was a pretty dang good deal. So with that, let's get right into it and see what this camera has to offer. Now, the first thing you're going to notice about this camera is that it comes with 2 different style lens mounts. This is the Micro Four Thirds version. They also came out with an EF mount version. Now, which one is right for you? That's something you're going to have to put a lot of thought into because they are surprisingly different beyond the basic mounts. Now, the first thing you're going to notice about the Micro Four Thirds system, which is its only real big downside on this camera, is that it is a dummy mount. There are no active points on this camera, which are normally used for the camera to communicate with the lens. Now, if you're using lenses that are 100% manual with their aperture, with their focus, this won't be a problem for you. If you're adapting a set of Canon FDs, if you've got the Mica or Vajra lenses, or something along those lines, that won't be a problem for you. Now, the advantage of having a Micro Four Thirds mount on this camera, especially if you're using something like the old FDs, or you've got a set of Zeiss that have been converted to EF mount, is that you can put a speed booster on this to help you get a little bit more out of the sensor, because that is one of the downsides that a lot of people note about this camera is its small sensor. It has about a 2.3 crop factor, which does cause issues if you are using the EF mount version of this, because there's no way to adapt other lenses that aren't EF mounts to be used with this camera. And while the EF mount does have active points, meaning you can power your image stabilization, you can power your iris, you can power your focus, you're going to be limited to just those lenses. Now, EF mount glass is great. Canon makes fantastic lenses. The problem is that those lenses are generally designed with larger sensor cameras in mind, meaning it's very difficult for you to get to that wider field of view. And so you're gonna have to invest a little bit extra into getting wider lenses that you might not already have in your kit. One of the biggest downsides for me with having the Micro Four Thirds, even though I can adapt all my prime lenses to this, is that my favorite run and gun lens, the Panasonic 12 to 35 millimeter, does require active mounts. It has image stabilization, it has focus by wire, so that lens is completely useless on this camera, which was a downside for me. But keep in mind that this is called a cinema camera, and in most cinematic senses, you're not going to be needing that much flexibility. You're going to be set with using manual primes. The other complaint a lot of people have about the sensor size is you're not going to be able to get that sweet bokeh that everyone seems to be after. Now, I've done a video in the past where I talked about how I really don't consider that to be that necessary, but even that aside, this camera still does a good job of getting a shallow depth of field if that's what you're after. Here's an example of me using the camera with a 20mm lens with a speed booster, which makes it about a 14mm lens, and as you can see, it has no problem maintaining a shallow depth of field at a 2.8 f-stop. Now, another issue with some of these older cameras that people point out is the rolling shutter. So let's test it out and take a look at it so we can see just how bad it might be. This is zoomed in at an 85mm with the speed booster, making it about a 55mm lens, but of course with the crop factor, completely turns it into a telephoto lens. Now, I personally have never had much of an issue with rolling shutter. I think unless, you're doing something like La La Land or Whiplash where you're moving the camera very fast back and forth, or you've got a lot of trains suddenly going by in your close foreground, I don't really see moments where rolling shutter starts to play an issue. Now, sometimes obviously if you're shooting very stripped down and your hand jiggles, you might see some of that sort of jello cam, as people called it, as a result of the rolling shutter. But again, if you rig out your camera, if you build it up or you shoot on a tripod, you're avoiding fast motion, the rolling shutter shouldn't be a factor. But just so we can take a look at it, here you can see the impact of rolling shutter on the various lens sizes with this camera. Now, if rolling shutter is a deal breaker for you, obviously this camera does have it. There's ways now in post-production for you to correct it. Now, I will point out that the Blackmagic production camera 4K, which has a very similar body style to this, featured a global shutter, which got rid of the rolling shutter altogether. While you're shooting, you obviously want to have an ND filter, but when you're cutting out light, when you're cutting out the amount of light that hits your sensor, you need to make sure you're using an ND filter that features infrared cut. The cheaper type of neutral density filters that don't have that will distort the light, and the colors you get then onto your sensor aren't going to be true. They're going to be distorted. It's most notably seen in the blacks. They sort of turn a bit of a purple color, a brown color, and it is impossible to fix that in post-production. And sometimes you'll realize that much too late when you come back from a shoot and you find out that your footage in heavy sunlight, you didn't have a proper filter and it's more or less ruined. There's no fixing it. Maybe you can turn it black and white and that's as good as you'll get. So something to keep in mind with this, but it's something generally to keep in mind with just about any line of the Blackmagic cameras. Now, something that became very apparent to me almost right away is that the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K is much more a continuation of this camera than it was the original Pocket camera. If you take a look at the ergonomics of the features of this camera and what is featured on the new Pocket 4K, they're much more in line with one another, particularly when it comes to the more professional grade input and output ports on this camera. This suffered from a lot of issues. Its micro HDMI port is notorious for being broken if you're not shooting with a cage that has cable locks. Now, just going over the different ports that we had, we've got a Lank remote port, which I think is very useful if you're shooting, especially on a shoulder rig. You're not having to constantly reach back and find your record button. You can just trigger it off of your handles. That's something that I really wish that the new Pocket 4K did have. It doesn't have a record trigger hardwire. It only goes off of Bluetooth, which you then have to either run through an app or buy a very expensive camera grip. This has your basic headphone jack. Very interestingly, it's got 1/4-inch audio inputs. These aren't very typical to be seen in audio recording setups to run microphones into your camera. Now, there are workarounds. Wooden Camera does have an A-box that you can mount to your rail system that will then take XLRs and convert them to 1/4 inches to run into here. After that, it comes with what I think is the best feature of this camera, and that is an SDI output for your monitor. Now, the SDI, for some people, may be a bit of an issue. If you have a monitoring system that doesn't accept SDI, you're gonna have to find a workaround. Now, Blackmagic does have a converter box that you can buy for about $100. The only issue with that is it requires external power to translate that signal into HDMI. Another fix is obviously to buy another monitor that has an SDI input, like the SmallRig 502. And then a third option, which I think is maybe the best option because this falls in line with investing in gear that you can use later on down the road, is Wooden Camera sells what's called a C-Box. And it is powered by the V-mount that also powers your camera and all your accessories, but it'll take either an HDMI or an SDI input and convert it into either HDMI or SDI, depending on what you want to use. So not only do you get your signal converted, but then you have multiple ports that you can run other lines out if you also need a second monitor on board, if you're having an EVF, or you're putting it into a wireless transmission system. Now, I think this is a much better system compared to the micro on the Pocket, the original Pocket, which, as we talked about, was a major issue with this camera. If you didn't have port protectors, it was very easy for that to break. But just keep that in mind when you get this camera. if you want to use an external monitor, you're going to have a way to read the SDI signal. Then it's got a Thunderbolt cable, which is starting to become more and more obsolete. And then of course the power input, which is a nice size power port. You don't have to worry about it bending or breaking. Another aspect of this camera, which is very much in line with the Pocket 4K, is the screen on the back. Now this is a very big screen, very nice to look at. The only problem is that it's very low resolution. It's an 800 by 480 resolution screen. So for focusing precision, it's not the best. It's also not the brightest, and as you can see, it's also quite glary. So in sunlight, it doesn't make it the best option for looking at what you're filming. So it is recommended to have an external monitor. But even if you don't, it's still a step up from the tiny screen that may be on your Canon system, on some of your Sonys, or again on your Pocket Cinema camera. Now another really cool thing about the screen on this camera is that it's touchscreen, which again for 2012 was a pretty big deal. Now this menu on Blackmagic has always been a dream to navigate, and having it be touchscreen makes it even that much easier for you to go in and change your settings. Even though on the original Pocket it wasn't much of an issue, you still had to use the joystick to navigate, and every now and then you kind of lost track of where you were, or you accidentally exited the menu. It's a very well organized menu system, very easy to navigate because of the touchscreen, and it's a very cool feature considering how old this camera is. So would it even be a Blackmagic review if we didn't talk about the battery? This camera is extremely unique in the fact that it only has an internal battery, meaning you can't swap it out when you're in the field. You have to charge it or be operating off of an external system. Now when this first came out, the battery life, fresh new, lasted about an hour and a half of shooting. You could get away with being out and about with this thing, again in its most stripped down sense, and get an hour and a half, which actually isn't too bad. But then of course once it was dead, it was dead. This being an older camera, its battery doesn't hold the juice the way it used to. I found I get maybe 15 to 20 minutes of it without a battery option. So if you do buy this camera used, as with just about any Blackmagic camera, you're going to want to find an external solution for this. Now you can get something very basic that just adapts the Sony NPF batteries and runs them straight in. I think if you're looking to use this stripped down, that may be your best bet, and you'll get quite a bit of battery life out of one of those batteries. And then obviously if you're going to be rigging it out, getting yourself a V-mount system is also a very effective way to go. All right, let's talk about the media. This records to SSD drives internally, which is quite nice actually. Now I haven't done a whole lot of research on this, and I don't know how difficult it is to find SSD drives today that will work with this camera. I was very lucky that this one came with a couple so that I could use them. I didn't have to worry about tracking any down. But even when this camera was new, I do remember hearing the issues people had if you didn't get an SSD drive that could keep up with the performance of this camera, and there would be lots of issues of people having dropped frames and just things not working right. So you want to be sure that you've got SSDs that will work with this camera, be read by this camera, but will also keep up with the recording requirements of this camera if you're planning to use it in its fullest capacity. Which brings us to the various record modes of this camera. Now, as I said at the beginning, this records in a very impressive Cinema DNG RAW at 2.5K. It also will record in various forms of ProRes as well as DNX HD. So you've got a lot of different options to go. I, in general, always recommend shooting in RAW if you can. Now, with this camera, that becomes a little bit cumbersome. Right now I've got a 240 gigabyte SSD drive in here, recording at 2.5K in RAW. The card holds 47 minutes of footage. Now, just to put that in comparison with the Pocket Cinema camera, the original 128 gigabyte shot at 1080 RAW held 38 minutes. So for double the space of card, you're getting about 9 more minutes of footage because of the 2.5K versus the HD. Now, unfortunately, you cannot shoot the 2.5K in ProRes, and you cannot shoot the RAW in HD. There's some downside to that. Its ProRes is also beautiful. It's also very flat. It's also very workable. You can do a lot with it in your color grading. But I always say in general, if you can shoot RAW, even if you don't initially see the results, see the difference between the ProRes and the RAW straight out of the camera, I think later on down the line, you definitely will notice the effects of it. Shoot RAW if you can. So we've seen what this camera can do rigged out. Let's break this down, let's strip it down to its basics and see what we can get. Now, This camera, like I said, it doesn't have active points, so you can't use a lens with stabilization on it. So if you're shooting stripped down, you're gonna wanna try and get as wide of a lens as possible. A lens I really love and I recommend for just about any Micro Four Thirds system, and it's especially great with this because it doesn't require any power, is the Laowa 9mm 0D. Especially if you're shooting with this guy stripped down, the wide angle will help keep that shot a little bit more stable and a little bit less shaky and noticeable. Now also keep in mind this camera doesn't shoot beyond 30 frames a second. For some people that may be a deal breaker. For me, it really isn't that big of a deal, but keep that in mind because especially when you're shooting stripped down, handheld, and you're trying to rely on like a 60 frames a second to stabilize your shot, that isn't gonna work for you in this situation. Now again, just to emphasize to the people that are hung up about the small sensor size on this camera and the inability to get a wide angle shot, here I am with the Laowa 9mm, just pointing the camera arm's length straight back at me, and as you can see, it's plenty wide angle enough. I don't really see a reason why you need to get any wider than this. Something I noticed immediately, especially compared to the pocket camera, is actually how comfortable and pleasant this is to shoot stripped down. Its weight and its size really loaned itself to getting a little bit more out of it. You know, this record button that while it was on the rig didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, it wasn't easy to access, is actually in a very nice position when shooting in this way. Now another really great feature of this camera and of the screen is a secondary focal assist. Now all you gotta do is double tap the screen, it'll punch in on your shot, get you a little bit closer, and you can double check the sharpness of your image. So this is a great tool to use beyond the regular standard focal assist on the camera. Another quick thing to point out is that this camera is built in a very good way that loans itself to using a gimbal. Because it's so centered with its mount points where the lens is, compared especially to the Pocket 4K and 6K, this makes it very easy to mount and balance on your basic handheld gimbal. Just because I know it's gonna come up, what are the low light capabilities of this camera? I have strong feelings about the idea that, you know, let dark be dark, let black be black. Don't try and see in the dark the way that some modern cameras, you know, have now given us the ability to. If you're comparing this to the days of filmmaking, it was never expected for a camera to perform that way in a low light setting. If you're shooting on a set, and again, this is a cinema camera, it's meant for cinema production, you should be able to light your set anyway. But for the sake of talking about it, I went ahead and I took this outside at night where I only had street lamps going, and I put it to the test, and here you can see some of the results of that. Now you'll see in some of the darker areas at 1600 you will find some fixed noise patterns. I think that's easily taken care of in post-production by your colorist. They can stomp that out. But also, again, at 800 faster lens, I think your exterior nighttime shots are going to be more than usable. So something else you can see, obviously some of these shots are a little bit soft. Here where I've got a Canon FD 50mm 1.4 with a speed booster, makes that a very, very fast lens, but it's also very soft when it's open all the way. So I think if you're outside shooting at night, to get the cleanest image, obviously you want to stick around 800, you want to stop down your lens a little bit to keep it sharp. But if you're in a pinch, if you absolutely need to grab a nighttime exterior establishing shot and you're okay with having a little bit of compromise to your image, I think you can really push this camera quite a bit. I think you just need to analyze what are your actual needs for shooting. And if you need something that shoots in the dark, 100% cat eyes, yeah, maybe this isn't your camera. But I think if you're doing basic productions, if you're shooting in a realistic sense, that this camera will handle low light situations more than adequately for whatever your needs are. Of course, one other thing that this camera was notorious for was the black hole sun issue, meaning that if you shot this into direct sunlight where the sun itself was visible, the overexposure from that glowing ball of fire would burn out the image. Now, it wouldn't ruin the image, it wouldn't ruin the camera, but it would actually just turn the ball that is the sun into a black dot that appeared in your frame. That was definitely an annoyance for a lot of people using this camera. It is an issue with this camera, but I think it is a minor one. In the event that you do have to shoot the sun, it's very easy for you to paint out that black hole in your post-production. So who's this camera for, and is it a good purchase? Well, I think if you're looking for a very unique look out of your camera, out of your footage, this might be a very good solution for you. If you're looking to make a movie and you don't have access to maybe an RE or a Red, I'd say this is an outstanding low budget option for you to get cinema grade footage for your movie. However, if you're looking for an all-around camera, something that you can shoot your productions with but also shoot your weddings with, be run and gun, get your documentary stuff, I don't think this would be the camera for you to go with. I would recommend getting something that is a little bit more universal as your primary camera. This would be something more as a secondary, something more for fun, something to have in your arsenal that, you know, it already fits with the rest of your kit. It already works with the lenses you already own. It's only $500 worth of equipment to get something a little bit different at some point. Should you get the EF mount versus the Micro Four Thirds? I think that depends on what you're using this for. Is this more of a run and gun documentary camera? I would say get the EF mount because you have the ability to use lenses, more zoom options, you've got image stabilization, you've got accessibility with those that you're not going to get through the Micro Four Thirds. However, if you're shooting more of a lockdown type production, things are on tripods, things are controlled, I think the Micro Four Thirds is the way to go because you can get access to much, much superior glass. You can use old PL mount, Cook lenses, whatever. Anything you can think of will pretty much mount onto this camera as long as it doesn't need electronic assistance from the camera body. Price-wise, this is a little bit more used than the original Pocket Cinema camera, but it does require less peripherals to make it usable. I think having the SDI port makes it a better option than the Pocket Cinema camera. I think its overall size can make it more beneficial for you unless you're trying to use the size of the original Pocket to, shoot places you're not supposed to be shooting. It's going to be a point of argument for a lot of people if this looks more cinematic than the Pocket 4K or the 6K or some of the Canon systems. It really does come down to your flavor. But I think that the results of this camera, as well as the results of the original Pocket camera, are very unique. They're very unique to these cameras, and there's something that really hasn't been replicated by Blackmagic since. They've come close, they've given us some great things, but they still don't quite meet the organic looks that we got out of these original systems. So if you're after that look and you can't get your hands on the Pocket, I think this is an absolute great camera for you to consider using. Keep in mind the things, if you're shopping used online, see if the camera comes with the SSD drives. Those may be tricky for you to find. Make sure that all the ports are working, particularly the SDI output port, because the screen on the back will not be adequate enough to pull production quality focus off of. Now keep in mind, as I said, this is an older camera. It could have problems. If you're going to use this camera for a big, important production, I would recommend having a backup. Whether it's another Pocket camera, because these do match footage very, very well, or another one of these, or even if you have your Pocket 4K, or just another solution so that on the day of, if this camera has problems on set, you're not screwed. Because you'll find out once you start making larger productions that the cheapest part of shooting a movie ends up being the camera. You've put a lot more time and money into your sets, into your actors, into your overall production. So don't let the fault of an old camera ruin your production. And now the thing I think everyone wants to know, how does the footage stack up between these two cameras? Well, I took them both out again once more, shot some footage, mixed them up. You tell me if you can spot the difference. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and we'll see you next time.